It was the spring of 1944, deep in the European theater of World War II. In a sun-drenched clearing, just beyond the shattered remnants of a French village, a small group of German officers had been granted a rare reprieve from the front lines. The air smelled faintly of wet earth, burnt timber, and the lingering smoke of distant artillery. Birds circled lazily above, their song a fragile counterpoint to the ever-present hum of war machines miles away. Soldiers' boots pressed into the soft mud, leaving deep impressions that would soon be washed away by spring rain. A long, rough-hewn wooden table had been set up by American quartermasters. On it, neat rows of metal containers steamed quietly, each brimming with rations carefully designed to sustain a soldier through the grueling months ahead. The German officers, dressed in immaculate Feldgrau uniforms, approached with cautious curiosity. Some laughed quietly, exchanging smirks and muttered criticisms, comparing the neatly packed tins to the coarse, often monotonous fare they had grown used to. Yet, beneath their laughter, a subtle tension lingered. The sound of clinking spoons, the low murmur of American cooks, and the occasional burst of laughter from GI soldiers created an oddly surreal symphony, an oasis of order and sustenance amidst chaos. As the officers opened the containers, the scent of fresh bread, canned meats, and chocolate wafers filled the air. For a fleeting moment, war receded into the simple, universal language of food. Yet in the very next moment, this seemingly mundane encounter would become a lesson they would never forget, a stark revelation that the American military had mastered more than strategy. It had mastered survival. The German officers approached the American table with an air of confident superiority, their polished boots sinking slightly into the soft, spring, thawed earth of the clearing outside the village. The mud clung stubbornly to their soles, as if the land itself wished to remind them that they were far from home, far from the orderly training grounds of their barracks, and certainly far from the front lines where they felt most in control. Each officer carried himself with an innate sense of authority, their shoulders squared, uniforms crisply pressed, medals glinting faintly in the late morning sun. They had spent years cultivating an image of discipline and refinement, and even in this foreign landscape, they moved as though the world had been arranged to accommodate their scrutiny. But the table before them was unlike anything they had seen. A long, rough, hewn wooden platform stretched across the clearing, laden with steaming metal containers, each meticulously arranged in neat rows. The scent of freshly baked bread mingled with the rich aroma of meats and stews, a heady perfume that seemed almost alien to the officers, who were accustomed to the heavier, greasier fare of the German field kitchens. There were tins of chocolate, portions of powdered eggs, cans of condensed milk, and even neatly wrapped packages of coffee and sugar. A careful, almost obsessive attention to detail that spoke not only of sustenance but of comfort, of consideration, of a system that had thought of everything. As the officers drew closer, their expressions shifted subtly. At first, there were smirks, faint, almost imperceptible, curling at the corners of their mouths, as though they could already anticipate the simplicity and mediocrity of American rations. They whispered among themselves in low, clipped tones, words carrying the weight of experience and entitlement. Bread slices. Canned meat. How pedestrian. They gestured discreetly at the tins and containers, exchanging small, knowing glances. Their laughter was quiet but sharp, a kind of sophisticated mockery honed by years of military hierarchy. It was the laughter of men accustomed to judging, critiquing, and being certain of their superior taste, superior standards, and superior understanding of what a soldier should eat. With deliberate care, the officers selected their first tins. They opened them with practiced precision, the metallic clink of lids punctuating the air like a small percussion. Inside, the food was hot, steaming in gentle tendrils that carried both scent and promise. The bread was dense yet soft, browned perfectly along its crust, its interior fluffy and fragrant. The canned meats were rich, aromatic, and surprisingly tender, each bite releasing a depth of flavor that the officers had not anticipated. Even the powdered eggs, a simple convenience they would have mocked in any other context, carried a light, almost creamy texture when combined with a hint of seasoning. Chocolate, wrapped neatly in foil, melted smoothly on the tongue, leaving a lingering sweetness that was both comforting and, in a strange way, startling. The initial laughter began to falter as the first bites were swallowed. A subtle tension crept into the air, almost imperceptible at first. Like the quiet before a storm, smirks gave way to slight frowns of confusion. A whispered question, "Is this really enough?" passed between two officers, almost inaudible, but heavy with unspoken acknowledgement. The flavors, textures, and warmth of the food were undeniable, and yet they were unlike anything the officers had expected. It was rich without being heavy, substantial without being greasy, simple without being bland. Every element of the meal had been carefully designed to provide maximum nourishment, and for men who had endured the inconsistencies and often meager offerings of wartime kitchens, the realization was disarming. As they continued, the officers began to notice the details that had escaped them in their initial scorn. The tin containers were uniform in size and shape, easy to carry, stack, and store, a small but telling reflection of the efficiency and foresight behind their preparation. Each item had been measured and portioned to ensure that no soldier would go hungry, no energy reserves would be wasted, no morale would falter due to the simple indignity of an inadequate meal. The American soldiers who moved among the tables, ladling stew and distributing bread with quiet efficiency, appeared almost like orchestrated parts of a machine, fluid, precise, and utterly unhurried. There was no chaos, no frantic scrambling, no sign of the improvisation that the German officers were so accustomed to witnessing on the field. The officers' curiosity deepened. Conversations among the officers grew quieter. Instead of whispers of ridicule, there were now muttered acknowledgments, tentative statements of surprise. "They have thought of everything, even the smallest details." One officer, after a moment of hesitant contemplation, reached for a piece of chocolate again, slowly unwrapping it and letting the rich sweetness dissolve on his tongue. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in careful analysis. He realized that every choice, the composition of the meals, the ease of distribution, the balance of calories and nutrients, was part of a larger philosophy. The American army had mastered the art of sustaining men over long campaigns, and in doing so had built a quiet, unseen advantage that the German officers had underestimated at their peril. The air around the table seemed to change. Where there had been derision, now there was silence. Where there had been mockery, now there was observation and contemplation. The officers, accustomed to judging all they encountered with certainty, found themselves confronted with a truth that challenged their assumptions. The American rations were not merely food. They were a reflection of planning, foresight, and an understanding of the human limits of endurance. The officers felt it, almost instinctively, that the men who relied on these meals were not merely surviving, but thriving, prepared in body and spirit for the trials that lay ahead. By the time the meal concluded, any remaining traces of arrogance had dissipated. Plates that had been approached with sneers were now empty, wiped clean by men who understood, however reluctantly, the quality and purpose of what they had consumed. The officers rose from the table, some lingering a moment longer, observing the Americans at work, efficient, calm, and disciplined, and feeling the weight of a lesson that could not be undone. They had approached the meal thinking to mock. They left having witnessed a demonstration of ingenuity, preparation, and the quiet power of nourishment. In that fleeting encounter, the German officers learned an enduring truth that victory in war was as much about logistics, sustenance, and planning as it was about courage or strategy. that the American military, through a simple act of feeding its men well, had turned the ordinary into an extraordinary advantage, and that a meal, approached with confidence and derision, could transform into one of the harshest lessons of a soldier's life. It wasn't just the taste of the food that stunned the German officers. It was the reality of the American system behind it. As they sat in contemplative silence, watching the American cooks move with the fluid precision of a well-rehearsed orchestra, the officers began to notice the layers of planning that had gone into what, to the untrained eye, seemed like a simple meal. Every tin, every loaf, every morsel of chocolate and rationed meat had a purpose. Portions were standardized, calories meticulously calculated, nutritional balance ensured, and the distribution method designed to minimize waste and maximize efficiency. The Germans had fought long, grueling campaigns where men were often left to scavenge, supplement, or endure days of insufficient sustenance, but here in this sunlit clearing in 1944 France, the Americans were demonstrating that feeding an army could be as precise and strategic as the deployment of battalions on a battlefield. The officers' eyes followed the movements of the cooks, ladles dipped into large, steaming cauldrons of stew, scooping out hearty portions and pouring them into metal tins with a rhythm that seemed almost ceremonial. Bread loaves were cut with care, distributed in exact portions. Even the smallest details were attended to. Spoons were wiped clean, tin lids replaced with minimal disruption, and surplus rations stored away systematically. There was no chaos, no frantic scrambling, no improvisation that might have been expected in a combat zone. Every motion was calculated to preserve time, resources, and morale. The officers could not help but notice the stark contrast with their own field kitchens, where shortages, inconsistent preparation, and improvisation were constant challenges. Here, the Americans had mastered an invisible weapon, one that silently bolstered their troops' resilience and stamina, while leaving the enemy unprepared for the quiet efficiency behind each meal. As the German officers observed, the logic of the system began to dawn on them. They noticed that each soldier consuming the rations looked alert, energized, and focused. None appeared lethargic, nor were they distracted by hunger or dissatisfaction. The officers had experienced firsthand how even a single poorly managed meal could ripple through a unit, diminishing combat effectiveness, lowering morale, and increasing stress among men already stretched to their limits. Yet here, the Americans seemed to have neutralized that vulnerability entirely. The combination of quality, consistency, and careful planning had created an army that could sustain itself over weeks of movement and engagement, regardless of terrain, weather, or enemy action. It became impossible for the German officers to ignore the subtleties of the operation. The containers themselves were designed for rapid distribution, uniform, stackable, and compact, allowing for quick transport and minimal handling. They noticed the deliberate spacing of the distribution tables, designed to accommodate both the flow of soldiers and the efficiency of the cooks. Every action, from the folding of utensils to the precise measurement of rations, reflected foresight and discipline. Even the timing of the meals appeared orchestrated, synchronized with the soldiers' movements and duties, so that no man would be over or underfed, and each would receive maximum sustenance at precisely the moment it was most needed. This attention to detail was more than just administrative, it was tactical. The German officers understood the importance of morale in prolonged engagements, yet they had rarely witnessed it leveraged with such subtlety. The Americans were not simply feeding men. They were sustaining an entire fighting force, shaping readiness and resilience at a foundational level. It was the quiet power of logistics on display, the ability to project force not only through weapons and strategy, but through foresight, planning, and understanding the human body's needs. Every bite, every sip, Every carefully measured portion was an investment in performance, endurance, and cohesion. Gradually, the officers' perception shifted. Where derision had once existed, admiration, tinged with reluctant envy, began to emerge. They could see, in the subtle interactions between cooks and soldiers, the practical benefits of such an organized system. Soldiers moved without hesitation, ate without complaint, and remained attentive to instructions even after consuming substantial meals. There was a rhythm to it all, a harmony that allowed for maximum efficiency in both sustenance and operational readiness. For men who had grown accustomed to improvisation and coping with irregular rations, the revelation was profound. The meal was no longer a simple exchange of calories. It was a lesson in discipline, planning, and the quiet but decisive influence of logistics on warfare. The realization deepened when one officer reached for a second helping. By the end of the observation, the officers were silent, each lost in thought. Words of derision or mockery had been replaced by quiet acknowledgement, subtle nods, and lingering glances. They had entered the meal with certainty, convinced that the American rations would be simple, bland, or even laughable. Yet now they recognized the truth. Feeding an army well was not a minor concern or a trivial aspect of warfare. It was a strategic advantage, a tool of resilience, and a demonstration of foresight that had far-reaching consequences beyond the immediate act of eating. The Americans had transformed sustenance into strategy, ensuring that their forces remained capable, cohesive, and ever prepared for the hardships of battle. The officers shifted their focus to the soldiers themselves. Each man, fortified by the precise rations, appeared alert, focused, and ready for duty. Eyes shone with energy, movements were deliberate, and morale seemed quietly unassailable. It was not the presence of superior weapons or advanced tactics alone that made this army formidable, but the careful nurturing of its foundation. The men's ability to endure, recover, and remain effective in the field. The German officers had long underestimated the power of logistics, but here it was laid bare before them, undeniable, methodical, and effective. As the meal concluded, the officers quietly acknowledged the lesson before them. This was more than nourishment. It was preparation, resilience, and strategy embodied in tangible form. They had approached with scorn and skepticism, ready to ridicule a foreign army's simplicity, yet they left with a newfound respect for the quiet efficiency, precision, and intelligence embedded in every element of the American ration system. It was a subtle, enduring lesson in the power of preparation, one that would linger long after the last tin had been emptied, the last loaf consumed, and the American cooks had departed. In that sunlit clearing, surrounded by steam rising from tin containers and the measured efficiency of soldiers at work, the German officers had learned something profound. Victory was not guaranteed by tactics alone, but by the careful management of men, meals, and morale. And in that lesson lay an unspoken truth, that even the simplest elements, executed with precision, could yield an advantage as decisive as any weapon on the battle. By the end of the meal, the laughter that had once echoed across the clearing was completely gone. The German officers, who had approached the American table with smirks and whispered critiques, now sat in contemplative silence. Each bite, each sip of stew, each morsel of bread had stripped away the arrogance that had accompanied them that morning. What had seemed simple, mundane, and even laughable at first had revealed itself to be a carefully orchestrated display of precision, planning, and subtle power. They understood now that American rations were more than food. They were a demonstration of strategy, endurance, and discipline, a manifestation of military genius applied to the seemingly ordinary act of sustaining men. The officers reflected quietly on what they had observed: the efficiency of the American cooks, the organization of the tables, the uniformity of the tins, the exact portions, and the careful timing of distribution. All of it spoke to a larger philosophy, a commitment to ensuring that every soldier could perform at his highest capacity. Each element had been calculated not just for taste or comfort, but for functionality. These meals were designed to provide maximum caloric intake, balanced nutrition, and mental clarity. Every ingredient served a purpose. Every measure, every method, was intended to bolster the army's effectiveness in the field. In watching this unfold, the German officers realized that the Americans had transformed what they once saw as a trivial necessity into an invisible but undeniable advantage on the battlefield. The silence among the officers deepened as they considered the implications. In their own experience, scarcity and inconsistency had often dictated the rhythm of life on the front lines. Soldiers endured days of meager rations, improvised meals, or repeated servings of monotonous, flavorless food. These conditions weakened morale, slowed recovery, and amplified stress. Yet here, in the open clearing bathed in sunlight, the German officers observed the inverse: an army strengthened, energized, and disciplined by sustenance. Each man who ate at these tables would carry that advantage onto the battlefield, alert, coordinated, and capable of enduring hardships that might have otherwise depleted him. It was a lesson that the officers knew was as strategic as any tactical deployment or artillery barrage they had ever witnessed. Their attention turned again to the soldiers themselves. Each man moved with purpose, collecting his tin, consuming his portion, and then moving on in quiet efficiency. There was no complaint, no struggle, no visible fatigue. Even those who had been on the march for hours appeared alert and focused, their morale visibly intact. It was as if the very act of eating had been designed to recharge not only the body, but the mind and spirit as well. The German officers, trained to measure a soldier's effectiveness by drills, discipline, and combat experience, now found themselves confronted with a more subtle metric: the capacity to endure, to recover, and to maintain focus. A power derived from something as deceptively simple as a meal. As the clearing filled with the soft clinking of empty tins and utensils, the officers began to internalize a new understanding. The American approach was holistic, encompassing more than the immediate act of consumption. It accounted for timing, portion size, nutrition, and morale, all harmonized with operational needs. Every meal was a small, deliberate investment in the army's effectiveness, a calculated enhancement of resilience and readiness. The officers, who had come to mock, now realized they had been witnesses to a form of strategic ingenuity that transcended conventional combat. The ability to sustain men at peak capacity, consistently and reliably, under conditions where other armies might falter. The officers' own hands rested on the table as they contemplated the empty tins before them. The lines of organization, the symmetry of distribution, and the deliberate care in every movement revealed a discipline that extended far beyond the kitchen. This was not mere efficiency. It was a philosophy that began its slow descent. The officers reflected on the broader implications. They had approached the meal with confidence, certain of their superior knowledge and taste. Yet they now understood that they had been unprepared for this revelation. The American rations, which had seemed trivial at first glance, represented a level of strategic thinking that they had rarely, if ever, encountered. The lesson was humbling. In war, success relied not only on skill, courage, or weapons, but on the relentless, meticulous management of human resources, a power that could quietly tip the balance in favor of one side, long before bullets or bombs came into play. By the time the meal concluded and the soldiers began to move away from the tables, the officers remained seated for a moment longer, each lost in thought. The clearing was now calm, filled with the fading aroma of the consumed food and the quiet satisfaction of men fortified for the challenges ahead. There was no laughter, no derision, no pretense. Only the weight of recognition, understanding, and a newly acquired respect. The German officers had witnessed the extraordinary impact of logistics, discipline, and foresight manifested in something as simple, yet as profound, as a shared meal. They left the clearing carrying more than empty tins and satisfied appetites. They carried the knowledge that war was as much fought in kitchens and supply lines as it was on battlefields. That preparation, consistency, and care for the men could be decisive forces. That endurance, morale, philosophy, a guiding principle of military success that the Germans had underestimated. The subtle but profound lesson was clear: the preparation and management of men, their energy, nutrition, and morale, was as vital to victory as any weapon, any maneuver, or any tactical advantage on the battlefield. They could see it reflected in the soldiers' demeanor. Faces that had once shown fatigue now radiated calm readiness. Movements that might have been sluggish after a long march were deliberate and confident. Even the smallest gestures, a spoon lifted, a piece of bread broken, a tin returned to its place, carried an air of purpose and competence that reinforced the invisible strength behind the army. The German officers realized that the American army had mastered the orchestration of human energy, turning nourishment into a tool of endurance, morale, and operational support. One officer, in particular, lingered a moment longer, eyes tracing the precise organization of the emptied tins and the orderly return of utensils. He noted the absence of waste, the absence of disorder, the absence of confusion, hallmarks of an army that understood the connection between preparation and performance. In every detail, from the temperature of the food to the method of distribution, there was evidence of forethought and discipline. The Americans had created a system that maximized strength and minimized vulnerability, and the German officers recognized that they had underestimated the quiet, pervasive power of such careful preparation. As shadows lengthened across the clearing and the sun, and operational effectiveness could be nurtured through deliberate and intelligent planning, and that the army they had once approached with contempt had demonstrated a mastery of these principles in a way that was both invisible and devastatingly effective. In those final moments, as the officers walked back toward their vehicles, the setting sun cast long, sharp shadows across the mud-streaked clearing. The quiet realization lingered: American rations were not merely meals, but instruments of power. A subtle, unyielding force that could sustain men through exhaustion, hardship, and uncertainty, shaping the course of war itself. It was a truth that would remain with the officers long after the clearing had emptied. The last steam had risen from the tins, and the day had faded into night. In that moment, the German officers had learned what no battlefield could fully teach: survival, endurance, and victory often began at the table.